In Galatians chapter 2, verse 7, it speaks of these two apostolates. That is why Paul said that God himself constituted apostles because he constituted good and bad apostles, just as he constituted the devil. He was the one who created it, and he does good and evil. God is the ruler of both. Now notice what it says here in verse 7. But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me, as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel of what? Say, two gospels. There is a true gospel and there is a false gospel. That of the uncircumcision is for us Gentiles. That of circumcision was for the Jews. So there are two apostolates. Now you have to see the conduct of Peter in his apostleship. Look at what it says in chapter 2, verse 14. Look at what it says. Well, verse 11 first says that the leader of the uncircumcision rebuked the leader of the circumcision. In other words, Paul rebukes Peter in verse 11. He says to him, now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him face to face because he was from what? It means that Paul comes and says, look, brethren, I was given the gospel of the uncircumcision and Peter the gospel of the circumcision. But then he appears rebuking him. He said to him, you are condemning Peter. Someone would suggest, what if Peter told him, Paul, if you claim that God entrusted me with the gospel of circumcision, then remain with the Jewish community, as circumcision is a practice meant specifically for them. That is from Moses. That was a defective covenant. To the Gentiles, don't bring that. Therefore, during his time on earth, Jesus instructed his apostles to not venture into Gentile territory or share his message with them, as it was meant solely for the Jewish people. But then in verse 14, Peter does not listen to him. Look at what verse 14 says. It says, but when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, say, of the gospel. The gospel is the uncircumcision, which is where you are sheltered right now. The guarantee that you are walking in the truth, that you are not in a lying ministry, that you are not in a false apostleship, is that one. See how it says. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? What was Peter doing? He was forcing us Gentiles to what? For you know that Peter was wrong, because his gospel was the gospel of circumcision for the Jews. The gospel of Paul was for us Gentiles. And then what happens? When Paul goes to Rome, begins, because the Gentiles were there. The Romans were not Jews, they were Gentiles. Subsequently, Paul exclaimed, this land is mine. Peter, please refrain from entering Rome. This is my territory, the gospel of the uncircumcision. I want to take it to Rome. But when he began to speak about it there, Peter schemed and said, it is not convenient for this man to live. So the story, hey, those of you who are watching us on the internet, you will understand the story. The story says that Paul, his duty was to go where? To the Gentiles with the gospel of the uncircumcision. However, Peter, along with the apostles, arrived with the intention of putting him to death. So then, who was the first pope? Peter. And what did Peter do? Paul said to him, look, you are condemning. Do not bring me circumcision to the Gentiles. But Peter persisted. That's why Peter is evil. Peter was disobedient. I have to identify Peter in the nations, because if the Pope is listening to me, he will say, look, I didn't know that. Let me get out of the false gospel.